The lion lay in the dust, a heavy shape against the pale riverbed, his mane dulled with grit. His chest lifted only slightly, each breath shallow, each pause between them stretched long. Flies clung to the corners of his eyes and to the edges of a wound on his flank. He did not move to chase them off. He only stared, his gaze fixed, unblinking on the figures that approached from the brush. The rangers slowed as they drew near. Their boots pressed lightly into the sand, leaving tracks that curved around his body in a wide arc. The air smelt dry grass and blood. A thin wind skimmed the riverbed, carrying dust over the lion's mane. One ranger lifted a hand, signaling the others to hold back. The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of the lion's labored breathing. They had seen lions collapse before, worn down by injury, by hunger, by conflict with other males. This one carried the marks of a fight. Along his side, beneath his ribs, torn flesh showed where teeth had dug in. His hind leg was stiff, twisted beneath him. His tail flicked once, barely more than a twitch, and then went still. Every movement carried risk, shock, infection, collapse, and each hour left him weaker. The men studied him carefully. No sudden motion, no raised voices. The lion's eyes tracked them, dark and steady, but without the force of a full-grown male in his strength. He was too weak to rise, yet his gaze held the quiet of an animal that had not surrendered. The lead ranger crouched slowly, resting his hand on the ground. He looked for signs: bleeding, breathing pattern, the spread of wounds. From here, the danger was double: the lion's power if he chose to strike, and the certainty of death if they waited too long. Infection would spread quickly under the heat. A single misstep could drive the animal into panic, and panic would kill him faster. One ranger whispered, low enough for only his team to hear, "He's close to shutting down." The lion gave no sign of hearing. His sides rose and fell unevenly, each breath shallower than the last. A thin rasp came from deep in his chest. His head lifted half an inch, then sank back, muzzle pressing into the dust. The rangers laid their packs on the ground, keeping their movements deliberate and unhurried. They prepared the first line of action: allow advance with the tranquilizer, keeping distance, keeping calm. The weight of the decision hung over them. To move too soon risked pushing him into collapse. To wait too long risked letting his strength bleed away past saving. A vulture circled above, its shadow slipping across the sand. The lion's ear twitched faintly as the shadow passed, but he did not lift his head. His body told the truth. He had reached the edge of endurance. The tranquilizer rifle was raised, the ranger's breath steady as he measured the angle. The others watched the lion's chest, counting each labored rise. At the release of pressure, the dart struck lightly into the flesh of his shoulder. For a moment, the lion's head jerked up, his eyes flaring wide. A deep, guttural sound broke from his throat. Not a roar, not even a growl, but a sound shaped from pain and refusal. Then the sound ebbed. His head lowered again, mane brushing the sand, and his body pressed deeper into the dust. The medicine began to work, slow and steady. His breathing evened slightly, though it was still shallow. His eyes closed halfway, then opened once more, still fixed on the rangers as if refusing to let them leave his sight. They moved closer only after waiting, only after seeing his muscles loosen and his strength ebb. Hands touched his mane, checked the wound, and felt the shallow warmth of his flank. The injury was severe, but not beyond saving. Infection was the greater enemy now, and time. The riverbed stayed silent except for the rasp of his breath. Dust clung to every surface, lifted in faint spirals by the wind. The rangers exchanged no words. All that could be done now was to work quickly, to clean the wound, and to keep him alive long enough to move him. The lion's eyelids sagged, heavy, his chest rising in thin motions. Around him, the air carried only the dry whisper of wind and the smell of blood and dust. His body sank deeper into stillness, but his presence held, a weight on the riverbed, a reminder of strength not yet gone. In that silence, the rangers worked, their movements slow and precise, never breaking the fragile balance between life and its loss. Daniel moved slowly, each step measured against the dry hush of the riverbed. The other rangers stayed back as he had signaled, their shadows lingering along the scrub where the dust began to rise. Ahead of him, the lion's chest rose in shallow rhythm, every breath heavy with the weight of injury. Daniel lowered his gaze, studying the flank where torn flesh gaped. The wound was long, cut deep across the rib cage, the edges darkened with dried blood and dust. It carried the mark of another male's bite. The kind of wound that weakened quickly and could end a life within days if left unattended. The lion stirred, a faint shift in his shoulders as though instinct told him to rise. His front paws pressed weakly against the sand, claws scraping, but his hindquarters stayed pinned, one leg bent awkwardly beneath him. His head lifted only slightly, eyes catching the ranger's movement. Daniel paused, allowing the lion to read the distance between them. He kept his body turned sideways, posture low, every motion steady, careful not to force the animal into flight or fight. At this range, even a weakened lion could lash out with fatal strength. The sound of his breath filled the air, uneven and rasping, a reminder of how thin the line had become. If he pushed to stand, his body would not hold. Collapse would drive the wound deeper, rupture muscle, and perhaps puncture the chest. Daniel raised a hand behind his back, signaling stillness to his team. One wrong step forward by anyone else could push the lion into that desperate surge. The lion's tail flicked once across the sand, slow and weighted, the only outward sign of unrest. His ears twitched toward the faint sound of boots shifting behind Daniel, and for a moment his body tensed as though to gather strength. Daniel whispered just loud enough for the others to hear. "Hold." Not yet. His voice was steady, stripped of urgency, meant only to slow the pace of those behind him. He dropped to a crouch, close enough now to see where the wound spread into muscle, where infection threatened. Flies clustered, lifting in brief clouds and settling again on the exposed flesh. He knew time was short. Hours mattered now, not days. The decision was simple: sedate and stabilize, or watch the lion's body give way under the strain of his own effort. Daniel's eyes followed the slow expansion of the rib cage. Each breath carried strain, the skin pulling taut over the wound, small beads of fresh blood forming at the edges. He studied how much weight the lion could bear, calculating whether the sedation would hold before exhaustion tipped into shock. The risk hung heavy in the air. Move too soon, and adrenaline would surge through the animal, tearing already fragile muscle. Wait too long, and infection would root too deeply. The lion's head lowered again, mane brushing the dust, his mouth opening briefly in a shallow pant. The sound was dry, fragile. His body shivered once and went still. Daniel nodded once toward the team, signaling them closer. Their movements were careful, equipment lifted without sound. The tranquilizer rifle was readied, but no one rushed. Every motion carried the balance between saving strength and breaking it. Daniel stepped half a pace forward, still crouched, eyes fixed on the lion's flank. He studied the rhythm of breathing, counting, waiting for the chest to settle into something he could predict. The dart would need to land where muscle was thickest, where absorption would be steady. The lion shifted again, his paw pressing weakly against the ground, claws sinking into sand that gave no hold. His head lifted, eyes fixed on Daniel with a dim, steady clarity. The ranger's hand hovered near the tranquilizer, though he did not reach yet. He leaned back slightly, allowing the lion's gaze to pass through him. In the stillness, the only sound was wind through dry grass at the edge of the riverbed. Daniel spoke softly, not to the lion but to the men behind him. "He's too close to the edge. We take it slow." The lion's chest rose, fell, then rose again with more effort. Each breath was a weight carried against failing strength. His body sagged into the dust once more, unable to lift. That was the signal Daniel needed. He gave the order with a motion of his hand, the rifle raised, the dart sliding into place. The moment stretched long, air holding still as the lion's gaze locked one last time on the movement. Then the dart struck, a soft impact against the thick muscle of his shoulder. The lion's body jolted, his head jerking back. A low, guttural sound left his throat. Not aggression, only the deep protest of a body too worn to fight. His muscles stiffened, then slowly began to loosen as the sedative worked its way through him. Daniel waited, crouched, watching for the change. The lion's breathing steadied slightly, still shallow but more even. His eyes blinked slowly, heavy now, though never fully closing. He did not collapse. Not yet. The risk remained, but the worst of the moment had passed. The Rangers moved forward in a careful circle, keeping their steps measured, closing the distance with quiet intent. They would need to work quickly now to treat the wound before weakness pulled him beyond saving. Dust rose lightly around them as they began, the riverbed holding its silence, the weight of risk still pressing over every motion. The night settled heavy over the riverbed, the air cooling but carrying the dry weight of dust and blood. The Rangers kept their place at a careful distance, lanterns low, bodies still, never breaking the fragile calm that held the injured lion in place. Their breaths were quiet, words kept to the faintest whispers, meant more for one another than for the animal that watched them through half-lidded eyes. His body had not moved since the sedation eased, though his chest rose with steady effort. They had placed a container of water just within his reach, careful not to push too close. The sand showed the drag of their boots where they had set it down and stepped back. For long moments the lion ignored it, his head resting heavy against the ground, mane scattered with grit. When at last he stirred, it was slow, his muzzle shifting toward the faint smell of water. He pressed his tongue once against the dust, then turned slightly, dragging his chin closer until it touched the rim. The small sound of disturbed water was the only movement in the silence. The Rangers watched without speaking. Each sip carried risk, the strain of lifting his head, the possibility of collapsing beneath the effort. Yet without water, his strength would fall further. His tongue moved slowly, dipping and lifting, each motion followed by a pause as though his body needed the moment to recover. When he stopped, the bowl rippled faintly, half drained, and he lowered his head back into the sand. His eyes opened again, fixed on the men who remained nearby. There was no aggression in his stare, only the steady weight of an animal too tired to resist and too cautious to trust. His ears twitched once at the faint scrape of a ranger shifting in the dirt, but he did not rise, did not flinch. Exhaustion anchored him more firmly than any rope. Still, the risk hung heavy. If fear sparked suddenly in his body, he could push to stand, and in standing, his wounds would tear further. That collapse might finish what the fight had begun. The men rotated their watch in silence. Two kept their eyes fixed on him while the others rested against packs, never lowering their guard. Hours passed in measured stillness, broken only by the occasional rasp of the lion's breath or the faint rustle of leaves stirred by wind. They spoke only when necessary. Voices kept low and calm, soft fragments carried no further than a few feet. "Easy now," one murmured once when the lion's paw twitched restlessly against the sand. Through the night the pattern held, short movements, long stretches of stillness, and the faint glimmer of open eyes that never strayed far from the shapes nearby. The Rangers did not try to force more. They knew trust in this state came not from touch or presence but from restraint, from showing the lion that nothing more would be demanded of him until he was ready. By dawn, the riverbed was painted pale, light spreading across the dust and grass. The lion shifted again, ears catching the sound of birds beginning their calls in the distance. He lifted his head slightly, his mane brushing the ground, and blinked at the men who still sat where they had been through the night. His body trembled faintly with the effort, then settled again, too weak to do more. Yet he did not turn away. The bowl of water was nudged closer, slowly enough for him to see. The movement paused whenever his gaze sharpened. He did not strike, did not retreat. He only watched, steady, eyes dim but fixed, and let the object sit nearer to him. It was a small allowance, but in that stillness it was enough. The risk remained as sharp as before. Infection, collapse, sudden panic, but the night had passed without him fleeing, without him breaking his fragile strength in an attempt to escape. That single fact carried weight. The Rangers had given him space, and he had allowed them to remain. The sun climbed higher, spilling light across the ground where dust lifted in faint spirals. The lion's head lowered again, pressed back into the sand, his breathing slow but even. The Rangers watched in silence, the distance between them still holding, the fragile thread of trust stretching just enough to keep him there. The sun broke low across the riverbed, its heat already beginning to press against the earth. Daniel rose with the first light, moving quietly among the thorn trees where branches had fallen in the night. He gathered them one by one, dragging each piece into a small pile near the lion. Every movement was measured and deliberate so the animal could follow the action without being forced to react. The others kept their distance, watching both the lion's stillness and Daniel's work, ready to step in only if the balance tipped. The lion stirred when the first branch was lifted. His ears twitched, his head raised slightly, and his eyes narrowed on the sound. His muscles tensed in a faint ripple along his shoulders, but no strength followed. He watched in silence, body heavy, chest heaving with shallow rhythm. Daniel paused, setting the branch down slowly against the ground, waiting until the lion's breathing eased again. The shelter needed to be built, no matter the risk. Without shade, the sun would draw moisture from the lion's already weakened body, driving dehydration faster than the wound itself. Time under the open sky would shorten his chances. Every hour mattered. Daniel lifted another branch, pressing one end into the soil, bracing it with stone. The faint scrape of wood against earth carried across the sand, and again the lion shifted. His paw moved against the dust, claws dragging shallow grooves. He did not rise, only pressed the paw back into the ground as though to remind himself of the effort it would take. Daniel continued, his movements slow but steady. A sheet of canvas was unrolled, its edge catching in the faint breeze. The fabric flapped once, sudden and sharp, and the lion flinched. His body jolted, front paws pressing into the sand, head lifting high, and mane stirring with dust. For a moment, the tension crackled through the air. One surge of panic could push him to stand, and standing could tear the wound wide open. Daniel lowered the canvas immediately, holding it still against the ground. He did not move again until the lion's ears relaxed, until his chest fell into a shallow rhythm once more. When at last the fabric was tied into place, it draped over the angled branches, casting a narrow shadow across the ground. Daniel stepped back slowly, letting the lion see the space that had been shaped. It was only a frame, rough and low, but enough to break the glare of the sun. The lion's gaze followed the movement of light across the sand, his eyes half-lidded as the shadow reached him. He shifted once, his body tilting, then lowered his head again, muzzle pressed into the dust. The men spoke in whispers as they worked. Voices carried no further than a few feet. "Hold it steady," one murmured as another adjusted a branch. Their tones remained calm, their pace unbroken, and no sound was raised above what the lion could bear. Every choice was weighed against what was at risk. Panic meant collapse, and collapse meant death. The fragile line between survival and loss stretched with every motion. By mid-morning, the shelter stood complete, a narrow arc of shade falling over the lion's body. Daniel crouched low, watching as the animal shifted slightly, rolling one shoulder to ease deeper into the cool. It was not acceptance, not trust, only the natural pull of relief against the heat. His tail moved once, brushing the sand, and then his body went still again. The rangers stepped back, settling at the edge of the shade where they could see both the lion and the shelter that now covered him. Dust lifted in faint spirals as the wind moved, carrying the smell of blood and canvas together. The lion's eyes closed halfway, his breath steady but faint. Daniel rested his hands on his knees, watching the slow rise and fall of the chest. The sun climbed higher, striking hard against the canvas, but beneath it the lion remained shielded, unmoving, his strength no longer draining as quickly beneath the glare. The risk still pressed heavy: infection, exhaustion, the fragile balance of sedation fading. But for the moment he was not forced to fight the heat as well. The day stretched forward in silence. The shade held. The lion breathed. For now, that was enough. The heat of the day pressed down on the dry riverbed, but the shelter held its shade, a narrow line of relief drawn across the sand. For hours the lion had remained still, eyes closed against the glare, his chest rising and falling with shallow rhythm. Now, as the sun bent higher, his body shifted. One paw dragged faintly forward, then the other, claws carving a small path in the dust. With effort he leaned, pressing his shoulder against the ground until the weight of his body fell deeper into the shadow. His ribs rose more steadily once the heat eased. The change was small, but it carried weight. He was choosing the cooler ground rather than surrendering to exhaustion. Daniel watched, crouched a few meters away, his movements kept slow. The decision to enter the shade meant the animal was still responsive, still fighting the pull of weakness. It was enough to try the next step. A pack was opened in silence, and a small portion of meat was lifted out, wrapped in cloth. The smell carried faintly on the air, sharper than the dust, stronger than the canvas warmed by the sun. The lion's ear twitched, but his eyes did not open. His body remained still, heavy against the sand. Daniel placed the food a short distance from the lion, close enough for the scent to reach him but not so close as to provoke alarm. Then he stepped back, lowering himself again into stillness. No words followed, no sudden sound, only the silence of men who knew what was at risk. For long minutes, nothing happened. The lion's breath remained steady, head pressed flat, tail lying unmoved. The meat rested in the shadow, untouched, its smell drifting faintly into the still air. Hunger fought with exhaustion, the choice stretched thin by weakness. If he tried to rise, the wound could open wider. If he refused, his strength would bleed away further. Both paths carried danger. At last his head lifted, slow and unsteady, mane dragging across the dust. His eyes opened halfway, catching the small shape on the ground. His nostrils flared once, then again. He let his chin fall back, resting briefly before pushing himself to lift higher. The movement drew a low rasp from his throat, not aggression, but effort. His forelegs pressed forward, trembling as he dragged his chest an inch across the sand. The food lay just beyond reach. Daniel's hand tightened against his knee, but he did not move, did not speak. The men held still, knowing a single shift might scatter the fragile decision forming before them. The lion dragged once more, his muzzle lowering toward the offering. His tongue brushed the ground before it reached the meat. With one slow bite he tore a piece loose, chewing weakly, his body sagging even as he swallowed. It was not much, only a mouthful, then another, but it broke the barrier that had held through the long night. His body accepted the food, his breathing steadying again once the effort passed. He lowered his head after only a few bites, eyes closing, muscles slack with exhaustion. But the meat had been taken. The step had been made. The risk remained as sharp as before. The wound was still open, infection was still waiting, and collapse was still possible. Yet in the stillness of the shelter's shadow, the first sign of acceptance had shown itself. Dust lifted lightly in the breeze, carrying the smell of earth and blood. The lion lay within the narrow strip of shade, chest rising evenly, faint traces of food left between his paws. The rangers kept their distance, the silence holding, the moment enough to shift the balance. The days stretched into one another, each marked by the steady rhythm of care and the quiet balance of risk. The lion remained beneath the shade Daniel had built, moving only when the heat pressed too sharply against his skin or when thirst drew him toward the water placed nearby. His breathing grew steadier with each sunrise, though still shallow, still marked by the effort of healing. Infection had not yet claimed him, but it lingered close, a threat that shaped every decision the rangers made. Food was left within reach, water placed with patience, and never once was the space between predator and man forced closer than the animal allowed. By the fourth evening, the air cooled more quickly, dusk folding over the riverbed in soft layers of shadow. Daniel carried the bowl of water with the same measured pace he had followed each night. His boots pressed into the sand, leaving deliberate tracks that the lion's eyes followed. He lowered the bowl carefully, pausing whenever the lion stirred, waiting for stillness before continuing. The routine was familiar now, and the lion had not moved beyond the space of his shelter since the wound had laid him low. Tonight something shifted. The lion's head lifted higher than before, ears twitching toward Daniel's step. His eyes, though rimmed with dust and fatigue, held more strength than they had days earlier. For a long moment he only stared, chest rising, tail flicking once against the ground. Then, slowly, he pressed his forepaws forward. His body lifted an inch, trembling, then sagged again. Daniel froze, water balanced in his hands, aware that any sudden collapse could tear the wound wide once more. The lion gathered himself again. With effort he rose, hind leg dragging slightly beneath him, body shifting into a limp that pulled dust from the ground with each uneven step. His head lowered, mane brushing the earth, shoulders rocking under the strain. He moved not toward escape, not toward the scrub beyond, but toward Daniel, each step a fragile test of his remaining strength. The rangers behind Daniel stiffened, hands hovering near their equipment, but Daniel lifted one hand slightly without turning, signaling them to remain still. His breath steadied as the lion drew closer, paws heavy, gait uneven. Risk pressed sharp with every movement. A fall could undo the thin line of healing, and a surge of fear could end the fragile peace. Yet the lion did not show panic. His body carried only exhaustion and resolve. When at last he reached Daniel, he did not raise his head, did not bare his teeth. Instead, he lowered his muzzle slowly until it rested against the dust at the ranger's boots. The weight of his head pressed near the leather, mane spilling across the sand. His breath was warm and steady, each exhale carrying the smell of dust and blood. He did not threaten, did not test. He only remained, chest heaving, body lowered in a gesture that was neither surrender nor defiance, only allowance. Daniel did not move at first. The others waited in silence, watching the fragile thread of trust drawn taut between them. Then, quietly, Daniel set the bowl down at his side. His voice carried no more than a whisper. "Easy now," he said. The words meant as much for himself as for the animal. The lion shifted once, tongue flicking across the ground before finding the water. He drank slowly, head still low, body trembling with fatigue. Each sip carried risk, the balance of muscle, the strain on his wound. But he continued, steady, until the bowl lay nearly empty. Then he drew back slightly, lowering himself onto the ground again, this time closer than he had ever chosen before. The silence of the evening held. The last light of day stretched long across the sand, the air cooling into the kind of quiet that settles before night. Daniel remained still, hands resting at his knees, the lion's breath steady in the narrow space between them. The gesture was unexpected, but it was decisive. The distance that had held them apart had shifted, not broken, only bent enough to show what could be allowed. The risk had not passed. Infection, collapse, and the wild strength of the animal remained, but the fragile possibility of trust had entered the space where danger had lived. The wind moved softly through the scrub at the river's edge. Dust rose in faint spirals, catching the last red glow of the horizon. The lion's head rested low against the ground, his body stretched toward the shadow of the shelter, his breathing even. Daniel did not speak again. He only watched the slow rhythm of life continue beside his boots, the quiet weight of the moment carrying further than words. Each morning began with the same ritual of waiting and watching, but with every sunrise the lion's body told a different story. The tremor that once marked his steps grew lighter. His breathing, once shallow and broken, now carried a deeper rhythm. Dust no longer clung to him in the same still way. When he rose, his mane shook, strands lifting free, scattering grit into the air as though the ground no longer held him so tightly. The wound along his side had sealed in layers of darkened tissue. The edges hardened where infection might once have taken hold. It remained tender, a mark of the fight that had nearly ended him, but no longer the open risk it had been. Each day, when food was laid down, he moved more quickly to reach it. At first it had been dragging steps, body sagging beneath its own weight. Now he placed each paw with measured balance, his gait uneven but stronger, his tail rising faintly as he crossed the narrow strip of shade. The rangers kept the shelter standing, canvas stretched over its frame, though it had become less a necessity and more a place of habit. He no longer remained beneath it through the day. By mid-morning he would step out, nose lifting toward the dry wind, eyes searching beyond the circle of men who had kept watch. He would pause, ears pricked, listening to sounds carried faintly from the scrub, the low call of birds, the stir of unseen animals. It was a quiet reminder that his place was not fixed in shade, but in the movement of the wild. Daniel observed each change with caution. The risk was not gone. A misstep could still tear the healing wound. Hunger could return quicker than his strength. Panic, if sparked, could undo weeks of patience. But these dangers now ran alongside signs of recovery, no longer outweighing them. The lion's body had begun to reclaim what had been taken. One evening, as the sun fell low, the lion stood longer than usual. His body straightened, shoulders lifting, his mane brushing against the last light. He turned his head, eyes sharper now, pupils narrowing as he fixed them not on the men but on the far line of bush where the riverbed thinned. For a long time he remained that way, chest rising steadily, tail swaying faintly. Then he lowered himself again, lying close to the shelter, but the moment lingered, a sign of what would soon follow. The next day he moved further from the shade before returning. His paws pressed new tracks into the sand, circling wider, body swaying with effort but no longer bound fully to the ground. He shook himself once, a low growl slipping unintentionally from his chest. Not toward the rangers, but as though testing the sound again in his own throat. Dust lifted in a faint halo around him before falling back. When Daniel set down food that evening, the lion came forward without pause, shoulders rolling beneath his coat, eyes brighter. He tore the meat in stronger motions, chewing with the confidence of an animal regaining weight. Afterward he sat back on his haunches briefly, mane lifting in the wind, gaze distant again toward the scrub where his kind moved unseen. By the week's end the shelter remained, but the lion seldom used it. The canvas flapped lightly in the dry wind, shade falling across empty ground. Instead, he lay out in the open, chest broad, head lifted high. His eyes held the fire of strength returning. The stillness of the riverbed was no longer enough to contain him. The rangers knew it would not be long. Each day he stood taller, each step less burdened by the memory of collapse. Soon the wild would call him fully back. The wind carried dust across the riverbed, bending grass along the bank. In the last light of evening, his mane rippled against the breeze, his outline strong once more against the horizon. The night had passed without struggle. For the first time since his collapse, the lion had slept stretched long in the open, his chest rising in deep, steady rhythm. The shelter stood unused, its canvas stirring faintly in the breeze. By dawn, the air was cool, the light soft across the riverbed, and the rangers rose quietly, careful not to disturb what had settled into place. When the first rim of sun broke the horizon, the lion stirred. His ears flicked toward the sound of waking birds, and his eyes opened, clear and alert. He lifted his head, mane shifting as he shook dust free. Then, with deliberate slowness, he pressed his forelegs forward, shoulders rolling. His body lifted in one motion that once would have been impossible. This time he did not falter. His weight held. His stance was steady. Daniel watched, breath measured, knowing the risk still remained. A wound could reopen. A sudden misstep could undo weeks of patience. But as the lion shifted his hindquarters beneath him, the limp that had once dragged him low was only faint now, a trace of what had been. He stood taller, muscles taut beneath his coat, mane catching the first glow of sun. His breath came not as a rasp, but as a low, full sound, filling the morning air. For a moment he stood still, head high, eyes scanning the line where the savannah began. The horizon stretched wide and endless, the bush carrying scents and sounds the rangers could not follow. He flicked his tail once, then stepped forward, paws pressing into the sand with purpose. The rangers did not move. Daniel crouched low, hands resting at his knees, eyes fixed on each step the lion took. Every movement carried weight, the test of strength, the measure of whether he was ready to rejoin the life waiting beyond the riverbed. The risk had been the same from the first day. Collapse could end him. But here, in the light of dawn, strength carried more than weakness. The lion walked past the shelter, its shadow falling behind him. He did not pause, and did not turn to the shade that had guarded his recovery. His path angled toward the open, where grass bent lightly in the wind and the savannah stretched without boundary. Each stride was steady, mane shaking free as he moved, paws leaving deep marks that trailed away from the camp. Daniel let out a breath, soft enough that only those closest might hear. "He's ready," he whispered, though no answer came. None was needed. The lion's body spoke clearly in its movement, in the quiet fire that had returned to his eyes. The men stayed where they were, watching. They did not follow and did not try to keep pace. Their task had always been balanced, to give space when needed, to intervene only when life hung by a thread. Now the balance shifted again. It was the lion's choice, and choice was what marked the boundary between survival under care and survival in the wild. The distance grew slowly, each step measured against the horizon. His limp remained, but it did not hold him back. His head lifted higher as he reached the edge of tall grass, the wind carrying the scent of the herds that roamed beyond. He paused once, tail twitching, ears turning toward the sound of distant movement. Then, without hesitation, he walked forward until the grass swallowed his outline. The riverbed lay quiet once more. The shelter stood in silence, canvas still tied against branches, the marks of his body pressed faintly into the dust where he had lain. Daniel remained crouched for a moment longer, eyes fixed on the place where the lion had vanished. He did not speak again. There was nothing left to add. The wind shifted through the grass, bending it in long waves that caught the morning light. A soft hush spread over the savannah, broken only by the distant call of birds rising with the sun. The lion was gone. But the rhythm of his steps seemed to echo faintly across the plain. Daniel straightened, his hands brushing the dust from his knees. The horizon stretched open before him, wide and endless, the wild reclaimed.